I reached the cliff ledge just as the last light of day dipped behind the canyon walls. My backpack felt heavier than usual, loaded with camera gear and supplies for the night, but the air was cold and still, almost pressing against my lungs. Below, the Colorado River wound like a silver ribbon, silent except for the distant rush of water, muted and far away, as if the canyon itself had swallowed the sound. I set my pack down, pulling out the small lantern and arranging it on the uneven rocks. Shadows stretched long, jagged, and impossible, throwing the cliff into a strange geometry that made the ledge feel narrower than it had on the hike up. A sudden chill brushed over my neck, and I shivered, noticing the quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't empty but aware, like the canyon was listening. I moved to set up my camera, scanning the horizon, but every glance seemed to pull my eyes back toward the shadows. A stone edge dropped farther than my instincts allowed, and the wind carried a faint, almost rhythmic sigh through the rocks. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but the deeper I looked, the more it felt deliberate, like the canyon itself was stretching, widening, and settling into a shape that wasn't entirely natural. Night had yet to fall, but the ledge already felt like it belonged to someone, or something else, and I was only a visitor. The first pulse of unease settled in my chest, steady and cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Night settled over the cliff like a thick, suffocating blanket, and the Colorado River below had become a black, unbroken ribbon. I crouched by the lantern, checking its fuel and the batteries in my backup lights, but nothing explained what happened next. Without a touch, the flame flickered to life, small at first, then growing steady, casting a soft golden glow across the jagged rock and the narrow ledge. I told myself it was fatigue, the product of a long hike and my imagination running wild, yet the pulse of light felt deliberate, almost sentient, thumping in time with my own heartbeat. Shadows spilled and twisted across the canyon walls in ways that defied logic. A rock overhang seemed to lean farther than gravity allowed, while other jagged edges stretched into impossible angles, bending the night into an unfamiliar geometry. Across the abyss, I thought I saw movement, subtle at first, like a ripple in the corner of my vision, but each time I turned fully, nothing shifted. It felt as though the darkness itself was breathing, drawing in rhythm with the pulsing lantern, testing my attention. I stepped back, hands hovering near my camera, and noticed the beam of the lantern caught shapes along the cliff face I hadn't passed yet, forms I couldn't have reached without climbing or shifting stones. A part of me wanted to call out, to acknowledge whatever watched, but the air pressed against my chest, heavy and cold, making the sound of my own voice seem alien. I tried to focus on the pulse, to understand if it was random or intentional, but the rhythm was too perfect, too insistent, tugging me toward the edge while warning me simultaneously not to move. The wind picked up, carrying a strange metallic tang, faint but unmistakable, like copper mixed with wet stone, and the sound of loose pebbles shifting somewhere unseen made my stomach tighten. Every gust seemed to alter the shadows, stretching them further across the cliff, curling them around corners that shouldn't exist. I realized then that the light wasn't just illumination, it was a guide, a signal, and perhaps even a trap. Across the vast abyss, a darker shape emerged briefly, tall and still, almost blending into the night, yet aware, watching, responding to the lantern's pulse. I forced myself to sit, gripping my knees and staring at the fire that refused to stay small, wondering if the canyon itself had turned alive around me. The sense of being observed became unbearable, a slow tightening in my chest, and even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the edges of the shadows shifted in unison with the light. I couldn't escape the feeling that something unseen, patient, and ancient had claimed this ledge before I arrived, and every pulse of the lantern was a reminder. It knew I was here. It had already begun to map my presence. Morning came with a deceptive calm. The sun had barely risen over the canyon when I noticed the first subtle change. The trail I had memorized the night before no longer matched the one under my boots. Loose scree and scattered boulders had shifted, forming new cracks and ledges where there had been none. Every familiar rock, every notch I had relied on to navigate now felt foreign, and my sense of direction began to unravel. I tried to mark my path, scratching lines into the stone and stacking small cairns, but when I looked back a few steps later, some were gone. And others had shifted as if the canyon had rearranged itself while I wasn't watching. The deeper I moved into the morning light, the more disoriented I became. Trails looped back on themselves, twisting impossibly, leading me closer to the cliff edge rather than toward safety. A narrow passage I had passed the night before now appeared blocked, and a slope I had avoided now beckoned like a shortcut. But when I stepped onto it, it crumbled beneath me, forcing me back. Each time I tried to chart a route down, the landscape seemed to fold, closing off exits and pushing me toward the center of the ledge. I realized then that the canyon wasn't just vast, it was deliberate, aware, reshaping itself in response to me. From across the abyss, I glimpsed it again, the tall, thin figure, motionless, statuesque, yet impossibly present. Its form was hard to define against the canyon walls, blending with shadow and sunlight, but the awareness behind it was palpable. Every movement I made, every step seemed anticipated. My pulse quickened, syncing with the rhythm of the lantern still glowing at my feet, even in the morning light. It guided me without my permission, a silent heartbeat drawing me forward, and I couldn't shake the sense that every misstep was noticed, catalogued, and subtly corrected by whatever watched. I crouched to examine the ground, tracing shallow impressions that might be footprints, only to find faint markings that didn't match my boots. Too long, too thin, like claws or elongated fingers. They followed my path without leading anywhere new, looping back toward the ledge as if the earth itself refused to let me leave. Each time I glanced toward the figure across the chasm, it remained perfectly still. Yet something in the air vibrated, a low resonance that mirrored my heartbeat, a hum almost imperceptible, but growing sharper with every hesitant step. By midday, the canyon had become a labyrinth, a quiet, patient prison. Sunlight revealed cracks and shadows that weren't there the day before, and the once solid paths seemed unstable, threatening to swallow me into darkness with one misstep. I understood, with a creeping terror, that the ledge, the cliffs, and the canyon itself had conspired before I arrived. The figure across the abyss remained, watching, unyielding, and the pulse of the lantern beneath my hand guided me onward, toward unknown ends, toward traps I could not yet see, toward a canyon that was not merely a place, but a force waiting for me to move exactly where it chose. By the time the sun had climbed higher, I could no longer deny it. The figure across the abyss was real, tall, impossibly thin, almost statuesque, standing at the far edge of a chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly below. It didn't move toward me, yet every instinct screamed that it was aware of me, tracking each step with patience I could feel in the air. Shadows clung unnaturally to its elongated frame, twisting in ways that defied the sun's angle. I tried to blink it away to focus on the ground beneath my boots, but each glance upward returned the same impossible image. The watcher, always in the right place, always waiting. The pulse of the lantern beneath my hand quickened, syncing with my heartbeat in a rhythm I couldn't ignore. Each flicker seemed to draw shapes onto the canyon walls, patterns that bent and leaned as though the rock itself was alive, echoing the figure's presence. The wind carried whispers I couldn't identify, low, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to trace the edges of my thoughts, threading around the panic rising in my chest. I reached for my camera, snapping photos of the figure, but when I reviewed them, the abyss appeared empty. Nothing there but shadow and stone, yet I had seen it with my own eyes. I attempted to descend, seeking safety in the paths I had memorized the night before, but the canyon resisted. Every rock, every ledge I thought familiar seemed subtly shifted, a step away from where it should have been. Loose gravel threatened to give beneath my weight, and narrow cracks widened unpredictably. My pulse and the lantern's glow became a single, inseparable rhythm, guiding me toward areas I hadn't yet traversed, leading me closer to the figure across the chasm without my consent. It was impossible, but the canyon had become deliberate, orchestrated by something patient and ancient. Time lost meaning. Each second stretched as I tried to read the shadows, calculate distance, anticipate the figure's attention. The wind brought a low, resonant hum, vibrating through my bones, and the pulse of the lantern responded, not merely reflecting my heartbeat, but dictating it, controlling the tempo of my fear. Every glance at the watcher revealed minute changes, a slight lean, a shadow stretching further, as if measuring my endurance. I understood then that it was not human in any conventional sense, yet it bore no hostility. Only an intense awareness, a focus that felt like a predator studying prey without need for motion. By mid-afternoon, the canyon had become a theater for something beyond my comprehension. The figure remained motionless, but the landscape shifted with its attention, folding trails and shadows toward the ledge, guiding me along a path I hadn't chosen. I felt small, fragile, exposed, yet incapable of breaking the rhythm dictated by the pulsing lantern. My hands trembled as I realized the watcher did not chase. It simply observed, and the canyon itself carried out its will. The abyss seemed infinite, and every pulse, every shadow, every whisper told me that leaving was not a matter of choice. I had entered a space where time and terrain were alive, aware, and I was a participant in something far older and patient than I could imagine. As the shadows lengthened and the lantern pulsed beneath my hand, I began to move, though every instinct screamed to stay still. The cliffside trails I had memorized the night before seemed subtly altered, folding back toward the ledge instead of leading me down. Loose rocks shifted as if nudged by unseen hands, roots and scree-forming obstacles I knew weren't there before. Each step felt orchestrated, measured, as though the canyon itself was testing my patience and resolve. The pulsing glow of the lantern quickened, lighting areas I hadn't passed, illuminating cracks and ledges that I couldn't recall from my previous mapping. I realized I was not navigating the terrain. The terrain was navigating me. The wind carried faint whispers, fragmented and indistinct, brushing past my ears like distant echoes of voices I could almost understand. Shadows along the canyon walls elongated and recoiled in response to the lantern's light, forming patterns that suggested presence without form. I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, small yet deliberate, shadows sliding across the rock in rhythm with the pulsing glow. The figure across the abyss remained motionless, an unblinking sentinel, its awareness seemingly amplifying the canyon's subtle manipulations. Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go that wasn't preordained, no path that didn't curve back toward the ledge. I tried to slow my pace, to resist the pull, but each pause brought a faint vibration through the ground, like a heartbeat larger than my own, syncing with the lantern's rhythm. Rocks that had been stable shifted beneath my feet, tiny avalanches of gravel nudging me forward. I caught myself tracing the light's pulses, almost hypnotized, my body moving in tandem with something unseen. The canyon's geometry was impossible. Angles that should not have existed, ledges that appeared and disappeared depending on the lantern's glow, all guiding me deeper into a maze I did not create. Time became meaningless. Minutes, hours, or perhaps only seconds passed in a disorienting blur. The pulses of the lantern were no longer mere light. They dictated my movement, my attention, my breathing. I realized that my fear was being measured, counted, and acknowledged, though not with malice, only deliberate, patient observation. Every step forward revealed new, impossible formations in the rock, cracks that hadn't been there, gaps that yawned wider than physics allowed. The figure's presence across the abyss was a constant, silent force, and with every pulse, the canyon bent to its awareness, corralling me toward an unseen design. By the time twilight approached, I understood that I was no longer exploring. I was participating in a pattern, a ritual written into the canyon itself. The pulse guided me, illuminating the path I could not yet perceive, while the figure remained still, patient, unjudging. The cliffside was not merely a landscape, it was alive, aware, deliberate. My every move, every hesitation was accounted for. Escape was not a possibility. It was a test of endurance, of attention, of survival under the guidance of something ancient and unseen, and the lantern's pulse marked the rhythm of its watching, patient heartbeat. The first light of dawn crept over the canyon, pale and hesitant, and for a fleeting moment, the oppressive weight of the night seemed to ease. Paths that had twisted and folded in impossible ways now appeared almost familiar, as if the canyon itself had released a portion of its hold. I paused, scanning the ledges and jagged rocks for any sign of the towering figure, but it was gone. And yet, its presence lingered, woven into the pulse of the lantern, in every shadow that clung to the cliff walls, in the subtle tremor of the air around me. The canyon had not abandoned me. It had simply shifted its game, revealing only what it chose, leaving questions in place of answers. I crouched beside the lantern, noticing that marks I had left in the rock, scratches, piles of stones, tiny cairns meant to guide me, had vanished or been altered. Trails I had painstakingly mapped were unrecognizable, the landscape seemingly erased and rewritten overnight. Each pulse of the lantern reflected in the stone, as though aware of my gaze, beckoning, guiding, and warning all at once. I understood then that the canyon had always been patient, waiting for someone to enter, observing quietly while the world above continued unaware. This was no random landscape. It was a presence, deliberate and ancient, shaping its own narrative around me. The wind carried a faint susurration, not quite voices but echoes that hinted at memory, at repetition. I traced the edge of the ledge, looking down toward the Colorado River, its waters distant and indifferent, and I realized that the abyss was irrelevant. The canyon itself, the cliffs, the shifting shadows, and the pulse of the lantern were all active participants in something beyond comprehension. Every instinct I had for survival, every careful step, had been guided along a path I did not set. I felt the subtle pressure of being observed not just by the figure, but by the landscape itself, an awareness that waited, patient and unblinking, for the moment it had deemed right to reveal itself. As the sun rose higher, illuminating jagged rocks and crevices in stark contrast, I saw nothing of the figure across the abyss. Yet its absence was not relief. It was a continued presence, felt rather than seen. The pulse of the lantern had slowed slightly, as if granting me a fragile reprieve, a measured breath before the next stage of understanding. I realized that the canyon had not intended to harm me in a conventional sense. It had been waiting, allowing me to perceive the rhythm, the awareness, the intelligence in stone and shadow, and to recognize that my entry into this space had been anticipated, observed, and allowed. Every step I took back toward the sparse trails I had first discovered carried the weight of comprehension. The cliffside had been waiting all along, patient, deliberate, alive. The lantern pulsed faintly as I moved, a heartbeat of something immense, ancient, and unseen. I understood then that leaving was not about retracing steps or navigating terrain. It was about acknowledging that the canyon had chosen its witness, and in doing so had revealed a fragment of its eternal vigilance. The figure was gone, yet it had never left. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled every nerve, that the canyon would wait for the next traveler, as it had waited for me. They reached the rim of the canyon just as the sun hung low, painting the walls in a warm, amber glow. Below, the emptiness stretched for miles, silent and still, the kind of silence that felt like a weight pressing against the chest. At first, it was just the wind brushing against the rocks, but then came the faintest sound, a ripple of laughter, almost playful, almost human, drifting up from the depths. They paused, listening, exchanging uneasy glances that said more than words could. The murmurs twisted and curled, carrying a cadence that unnervingly mirrored their own private thoughts, the little doubts, the half-formed fears, the things they never voiced aloud. The canyon seemed to breathe with them, inhaling their attention, exhaling tension into the air. Every instinct urged them to move, yet they stayed frozen, caught between awe and a rising, inexplicable dread, aware that the emptiness below was anything but empty. They stepped carefully along the narrow ledges, the canyon stretching endlessly below, each footfall echoing against walls that seemed impossibly tall. At first, it was subtle, gravel crunching differently than it should, a loose rock sliding in the wrong direction. But soon the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Each step they took seemed to produce echoes that didn't align with their movements, sounds offset by fractions of a second, as if the canyon had grown impatient, mocking them. A whistle of wind, or something like it, swept through the gaps in the rock, carrying fragments of sound that mirrored their own thoughts. The words weren't spoken aloud, not exactly. They were snippets, fleeting and intimate. Phrases that only they would know, whispered and repeated with uncanny precision. The canyon didn't just echo, they realized, it responded. Loose gravel shifted underfoot, always undercutting expectation. A rock that should have been solid gave way, almost imperceptibly, forcing a stumble. One of them caught themselves just in time, but the sound that followed, the laughter rising from the canyon floor, was immediate, deliberate, and cruel. It wasn't just echoing gravity or the wind anymore. It was aware. They tried to ignore it, to force logic onto what they heard, to ground themselves in reason. Canyon winds make strange sounds. Footfalls on gravel echo oddly in narrow spaces. Yet the canyon's pattern repeated too precisely, timing the movements of pebbles, the rhythm of shifting rock, the cadence of the whispers. All to match their heartbeat, all to mirror their fear. Shadows clung stubbornly to the crevices, lengthening unnaturally even as the sun moved across the sky. Shapes emerged in peripheral vision, mist curling between jagged rocks, vague forms that dissolved the moment they turned to face them. Every turn along the trail seemed familiar, yet wrong, like a memory distorted by some unseen hand. The canyon wasn't merely a place, it was a presence. Their attempts to leave were thwarted in subtle ways. Paths that had appeared clear moments before now twisted, uneven slopes descending at impossible angles. Steps that should have led to safety brought them closer to the same point, forcing them to retrace, to stumble again along the uneven ledges. The echoes rose each time, swelling in volume and confidence, like the canyon was testing them. Amused by each misstep, every instinct screamed to retreat, but retreat became a trap. Each step forward was monitored, mirrored, amplified. The canyon listened. The canyon waited, and every heartbeat, every whisper of gravel, every shift in the wind reminded them that they were not moving through empty space. They were moving through something alive, patient, and aware, something that had been waiting for intruders to step into its echoing maw. They pulled out their recorder, hands shaking slightly, the device feeling heavier than it should have in the thinning air along the canyon rim. Every instinct told them not to, but they needed proof. Something tangible that what they were hearing wasn't just fear or imagination. They pressed record, waiting, listening. The first playback was almost innocuous. The wind whistled, rocks shifted. But then the voices returned, not as echoes, not as distant murmurs, but as words. Words they hadn't spoken aloud, phrases that had lingered in their minds for hours. Private thoughts murmured as if the canyon itself had been listening all along. Every hesitation, every fleeting doubt was repeated back to them, perfectly timed. Their hearts pounded in rhythm with the playback, a sickening mimicry of their own nervous anticipation. They tried to laugh it off at first, joking about how natural acoustics can deceive the human mind. But the canyon seemed to twist subtly around them. A ledge that had looked stable a moment ago now sloped in the wrong direction. A familiar tree seemed to have shifted. The trail beneath their feet, which they thought they knew, curved in ways that no map or memory could account for. Every step they took now carried an unnerving self-consciousness. They noticed the silence more than the sound, the absence of wind, the stillness in the rocks, and realized the canyon was responding to them, shaping itself around their presence. Shapes appeared in misty gaps between cliffs, forms that melted the instant they were faced directly. Yet their absence was as compelling as a figure standing in plain view. One of them tried to speak aloud, to call out the words the recorder had captured, to break the rhythm, to assert control. But the canyon swallowed the sound, returning it altered, rearranged, mocking. The phrases weren't just repeated, they were rearranged into insinuations, teasing fears, intimate knowledge made audible. A creeping realization formed. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't natural. This wasn't coincidence. The canyon's awareness wasn't limited to sound. Loose rocks shifted, not with gravity but with intent, tripping the unwary, forcing cautious steps into unpredictable places. Shadows lengthened and receded with an unnatural fluidity, marking the space as something alive, something patient, something that had been shaping its responses for hours, maybe longer. They moved cautiously, trying to retreat, only to find that every familiar landmark now seemed subtly changed. A narrow ledge twisted slightly. A small cairn, which had marked a safe path, appeared closer than it should have. The canyon was no longer merely terrain. They were navigating a conscious environment, one that reacted, learned, anticipated. And still, the recorder whispered their thoughts back to them, slower, faster, always precise, a reminder that the canyon was listening, watching, aware. Each playback reinforced the inescapable truth. They were no longer mere hikers. They were subjects in a space that knew them, that had been studying them, waiting to see how they would move, and how they would respond to the echoes of their own mind. Every step became a negotiation with the canyon itself. Loose gravel shifted beneath their feet, but not predictably. Rocks that seemed stable one moment gave way the next, sliding in ways that defied gravity, as if the earth itself had decided which way they should fall. They leaned instinctively, catching themselves on jagged edges, only to realize the ledges weren't where they had remembered them. Each misstep was met with a chorus of echoes, laughter stretching and contorting with the movement of the rocks. The canyon no longer felt like a neutral space. Slopes reversed underfoot, cliffs appeared impossibly closer, and trails they had relied on moments ago now led them back toward the rim, looping in defiance of logic. The air was thick, and every breath seemed heavier, weighted with the presence of something unseen. The whistling that had followed them from the first ridge now intensified, echoing in time with their rapid heartbeats. Every pulse, every inhalation seemed measured and mocked by the canyon itself. One of them slipped. Gravel gave way beneath a boot, sending a shock of panic through their chest. The echo that followed wasn't a neutral sound. It roared with exultation, layered with distant laughter and a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. Instinctively, the other reached out, gripping an outcrop, feeling it quiver under their touch, as though acknowledging the canyon's amusement. It was no longer just a landscape. They were participants in a malevolent game. They tried to retreat, to find solid footing, to follow familiar landmarks, but the canyon refused their logic. Every path curved, doubled back, or fell away into unseen depths. A ridge that had once seemed safe now hung at an impossible angle, the horizon bending unnaturally, warping their sense of scale. Shadows pooled where none should exist, forming shapes that disappeared when faced, yet left impressions in the mind that persisted long after the eye could no longer follow. The whistling became a guide, but not a helpful one. It shifted unpredictably, rising and falling, moving with them, drawing their gaze to cliffs that weren't there a moment before, to gaps between rocks that seemed to open and close with purpose. They felt a pull, an inexorable draw toward the canyon's unseen depths, toward whatever consciousness waited below the rim. Every instinct screamed to resist, but every step forward was involuntary, compelled by the canyon's quiet insistence. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps they had only moved seconds. Gravity itself became a suggestion, the laws of the natural world bending to a will they could not name. The echoes of their own thoughts, captured and distorted by the canyon, surged around them, shaping perception, guiding steps, amplifying fear. By the time they stopped to catch their breath, the realization had settled like a stone in their chest. The canyon was not passive. It observed, it tested, it responded. And for every misstep, for every slip or glance, it had an answer, waiting in the shift of rock, the whispering wind, and the mocking cadence of their own racing hearts. Escape was no longer certain. They were in the canyon's grip, and it had already decided how far it would let them go. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the cliffs, pooling in crevices and folding over ledges where light should have been. The canyon's depth seemed alive, breathing, its darkness pulsing in time with the echoes that circled around them. Every step they took was accompanied by whispers, laughter, and cries layered impossibly together, bouncing from wall to wall in a symphony of subtle menace. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. Every familiar landmark shifted, almost imperceptibly. A rock they had leaned against moments before now jutted at a different angle. A tree that had lined the rim now appeared farther down the slope, its roots impossibly twisted. The trail they had been following warped beneath their feet, leading them not toward safety, but toward vantage points that felt watched. Somewhere beyond the rim, the canyon waited, unseen eyes observing, judging, drawing them further into its folds. The whistling had returned, this time layered, echoing from multiple directions, bouncing off cliffs in a way that made it impossible to locate the source. Each note matched their heartbeat, each pause aligned with their inhalations. Fear was no longer reactionary. It was complicit, shaping perception, dictating attention. Shadows between jagged rocks flickered, forming shapes that disappeared when looked at directly, yet left impressions that lingered, gnawing at the mind. Loose gravel gave underfoot, subtle at first, then more aggressively, forcing micro-adjustments in balance that made each movement exhausting. They sensed the canyon responding to them, reacting to hesitation or panic, as if every slip, every glance, every heartbeat was cataloged and amplified. Echoes mimicked more than sounds now. They mimicked thought patterns, whispers drawn from the corners of memory, warped into phrases they hadn't spoken aloud. One moment, a ledge seemed solid and familiar. The next, it receded, giving way to a gap that hadn't existed before. Panic rose in tandem with the sounds, creating a rhythm, the canyon's rhythm, their hearts trapped within it. Every instinct screamed to climb back, to distance themselves from the cliff's edge, yet every path led them closer to vantage points where they could feel the canyon's awareness pressing against them. They realized the canyon's silence was never truly silence. Even when the echoes paused, a low hum persisted, vibrating through the soles of their shoes, through the rocks beneath their hands, threading into their chest and spine. Awareness was everywhere, behind them, above, below, and the sensation of unseen eyes was undeniable. By the time they paused at a narrow outcrop, sweat chilled by the wind and adrenaline mixing in the air, the realization was inescapable. The canyon was conscious. It watched, it listened, it reacted. Every landmark, every echo, every shadow was part of its design. It was patient. It waited. And the closer they tried to step back from the rim, the more the terrain bent, pulled, and guided them toward its intent. The canyon was no longer simply a place. It had become a sentient presence, folding the world around them, drawing their perception into its dark rhythm. And as they crouched on the edge, breathless and trembling, the whispers and layered laughter began again, circling, rising, pressing inward, reminding them that to leave on their own terms might already be impossible. Every step toward safety became an illusion. The paths that had once seemed familiar now twisted beneath their feet, folding in ways that defied logic. Rocks shifted subtly as if they were alive. Slopes slanted where they shouldn't, and ledges that had promised solid footing dissolved into emptiness when glanced at too closely. The canyon was aware of them. It knew every heartbeat, every hesitation, every micro-movement, and it responded. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, no longer confined to sound but vibrating through the air, threading into their nerves. Every thought they tried to contain seemed plucked and distorted, returned to them as echoing phrases that mocked both fear and doubt. Laughter, soft at first, now cruel and layered, rolled over the cliffs in uneven rhythms. The canyon's consciousness seemed to pulse, and with each pulse the terrain shifted, corralling them toward unseen points of observation. Shapes emerged in the mist between jagged rocks, fleeting and impossible to focus on. One moment, a figure crouched low, The next, it dissolved into shadow, leaving only the impression of impossible angles and movement that shouldn't exist. Every instinct screamed that something had been waiting, watching for longer than memory could trace. And now it was calibrating them, guiding them closer to whatever force lay beneath the rim. They tried to retrace their steps, but trails doubled back, ledges looped unnaturally, and echoes amplified every misstep. Even gravity seemed selective. One foot slipped as if the earth itself had shifted, then held firm the next. The canyon wasn't passive. It was interactive, a predator of perception, teasing, learning, and testing. Every heartbeat, every inhale became part of its rhythm, synced to the eerie whistle that had first drawn their attention and now merged with layered cries, whispers, and laughter. Panic became a tangible weight in their chests. The canyon's contours shifted to funnel them, to disorient, to manipulate. They caught glimpses of the deep void below, a yawning space that seemed to contract and expand in time with the echoing sounds, promising danger if misjudged. The world around them was no longer a neutral backdrop. It had become a living entity, bending reality around them, and every glance toward safety revealed another twist, another impossible angle, another reason to doubt their own senses. At the narrowest point along the rim, they froze. Shadows clung to the jagged rocks, moving against the wind, forming impossible geometries that seemed to pulse with intent. The whistle had become omnipresent, no longer carried by the canyon, but emanating from it. Shapes within the mist aligned with their movements, almost predictive, almost sentient. And then, in a moment of stark clarity, they understood. The canyon itself had been waiting. Patient, silent, measuring, aware. Their presence was part of a rhythm far older and far larger than themselves. Every attempt to flee was anticipated. Every step was guided toward the point where the canyon could observe and test, pulling perception into its awareness. When they finally descended toward safety, or what they believed was safety, the echoes followed, the terrain folded, the whispers persisted. The canyon had marked them. Not harmed them, not yet, but ensured that the memory, the sensation of its awareness, would linger indefinitely. Even as they stepped away from the rim, the realization remained. The canyon knew them, and it would not forget. The drive had left me numb, and for a long moment I simply stood at the cliff's edge, letting the last heat of the day settle across my shoulders. The canyon stretched out in patient silence, its colors draining into deeper rusts and bruised purples as the sun dipped lower. I unpacked my gear slowly, almost ritualistically, the kind of calm preparation that kept my mind anchored. This place was supposed to be quiet. Emptiness framed by stone and sky. A perfect sunrise shoot, nothing more. The wind skimmed along the ledges in thin, fluttering currents, brushing against the straps of my pack. At first, I didn't notice the difference, the way the breeze carried something beneath it. A thread of sound, too faint to name. I paused, hand hovering over a tripod knob, and listened. It vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the open air. Probably just the wind catching a narrow gap in the rock. Normal, harmless. Still, a small unease slid down my spine, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly, just lingered in the background like an unfinished thought. The canyon felt attentive, as if the stillness had sharpened after I arrived. I forced myself back into routine, laying out the tent where the ground seemed most level. The stone was cool, almost cold enough to bite through the thin fabric of my gloves. A sensible chill for late evening, I told myself, even as the air thickened with something harder to dismiss. An impression that the silence here wasn't true. Silence, but a pause. A held breath. Just as I tightened the last guy line, there it was again. A sound curling through the dying light, stretched thin and distant. Not quite a scream, not quite wind. Something between. I straightened slowly, eyes scanning the cliffs, but the ledges lay empty, washed in the soft orange of the setting sun. The canyon swallowed the noise again, offering no explanation. I set up camp anyway. Restlessness gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside with practiced denial. The world here was just rock and air, nothing else. Yet as the sky darkened and the last color bled out of the horizon, a strange certainty crept in. Quiet, insidious. The cliffs were listening, and they were waiting for me to notice. Night settled fast, as if the canyon pulled the darkness down early just to see what I would do with it. The first scream reached me shortly after, drifting up from somewhere far below, thin at first, stretched like it had been dragged across miles of stone. I froze halfway through tightening a strap on my pack, listening as the sound unraveled into something layered, rising and falling with a rhythm that made no sense. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal. It carried intention, like a voice imitating pain rather than expressing it. When the echoes faded, the canyon returned to a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. I stepped out onto the ledge, scanning the emptiness beneath me. Just rock walls, dropping into a depth I couldn't see. But as I leaned over, the sound drifted again. This time from behind, high above, then from somewhere to my right, as if the canyon were shifting its throat and trying different angles to reach me. The screams layered over each other, rising in ghastly harmony, a chorus without a source. My breath clouded in the suddenly cold air. I followed the sound along the ledge, keeping close to the wall, feeling the stone pulse faintly under my fingertips. Every step echoed too loudly, swallowed too quickly. When I reached the far edge, the scream snapped off, leaving only the thin rasp of wind. The rock looked stable, undisturbed, nothing but clean surfaces and familiar shadows cast by my headlamp. But as I turned to retrace my path, something shifted in the air, a soft pressure, like a presence leaning in from behind. I whipped around, but the ledge lay empty. My own heartbeat filled my ears until I realized it wasn't only my heartbeat. The ground beneath my boots throbbed once, subtly, a faint tremor timed with the echo of a distant, buried cry. I crouched and pressed a hand to the stone. The vibration continued, soft, patient, as if something deep inside the canyon was breathing against the rock. When the next scream rose, it didn't come from below or across. It bloomed beside me right at the edge of my hearing, intimate and close enough to stir the hair along my jaw. I stumbled back, eyes scanning wildly for another person, an animal, anything that could justify the sound. There was nothing. Just the canyon, wide and unbroken, its vastness folding in around me like a slow, deliberate closing of arms. The tremor beneath my hand faded, but the memory of it stayed, humming in my chest. I backed toward my tent with the irrational certainty that if I stayed in one place too long, the canyon would shift again. Tilt some internal passageway, open some unseen throat, and bring the screams even closer. By the time I reached the thin fabric shelter, the echoes had gone quiet, too quiet. A silence so complete it felt like the canyon was waiting for my next move, listening, learning, preparing its voice for me alone. I woke to a soft tapping beneath me. So faint it might have been part of a dream, but it returned with a slow, steady pulse that traveled through the thin layer of fabric and into my spine. At first, I lay still, listening to the darkness press against the walls of the tent. The air had turned colder overnight, sharp enough to sting with every breath, and the nylon around me quivered as if touched by unseen fingers. The ground throbbed again, subtle, deliberate, timed perfectly with the distant layering of cries that rose from the canyon in trembling intervals. It was as though the rock itself had a heartbeat, syncing itself to the sound. I unzipped the sleeping bag with careful, shaking hands and sat up, waiting for the tremor to stop. It didn't. Instead, it deepened, a slow, resonant vibration, like something massive shifting deep below the surface. When I glanced toward the tent wall, movement flickered at the edge of my vision. A shape stretched tall against the fabric, limb-like and impossibly long, bending in a way that made no anatomical sense. It vanished the moment I focused on it, leaving only the impression of something that shouldn't have been able to stand so close without making a sound. Another flicker appeared near the opposite wall, a long arc of a limb sweeping gracefully past, silent as a shadow crossing water. I told myself it was the wind, but the air was too still, the movement too purposeful. Every instinct in me urged escape, urged distance, but when I pushed outside, expecting open space and familiar ledges, the canyon felt rearranged. The landmarks I'd memorized the night before were gone. The path I had walked along now slanted at an unfamiliar angle, leading deeper between stone outcrops that hadn't been there before dawn. The cliffs loomed closer than I remembered, forming narrowed corridors that seemed to funnel me inward. Under my boots, the stone vibrated again. This time, through the arches of my feet, up into my legs, a warning or a summons I couldn't tell. A thin cry spiraled upward from some unseen chasm, followed by another, harmonizing in that unnatural cadence I'd heard the night before. Shapes flickered again, multiple now, their limbs moving in smooth, impossible arcs, each one catching only the corner of my eye before disappearing. Not shadows, not animals. Something else that didn't want to be seen fully. I backed toward the tent, the only familiar object left in a landscape growing stranger by the minute. The canyon felt aware, watching my hesitation, patient in a way that made my skin crawl. The ground pulsed once more beneath me, a heavy, resonant throb that felt almost expectant, as though it waited for an answer, an acknowledgement. And standing there in the cold half-light, breath fogging in front of me, I realized the canyon wasn't simply reacting to me. It was responding, waiting to see whether I would obey, or remain exactly where it wanted me. Morning never fully arrived. The sky lightened, but the canyon held the dawn back like a curtain drawn too tightly to lift. I tried retracing my steps, gripping the familiar edges of rock. But every path I recognized the night before ended abruptly in a sheer wall or a narrow corridor that angled deeper into the canyon's interior. I would trace a route I was certain led outward, following a distinct ridge, a marking on a boulder, and yet, moments later, I found myself staring at the back of my own tent from a direction that made no physical sense. The cliffs pressed in with silent authority, rising higher overhead, their faces leaning inward as though listening to every breath I took. The sound of my footsteps echoed strangely, repeating long after I stopped moving, bouncing around the stone in slow, measured rhythms that didn't match my pace. The longer I walked, the more the canyon seemed to reshape itself. Edges blurred into new angles. Shadows lengthened in stretched, impossible lines. A corridor that had been open seconds before closed behind me with a natural casualness, as if it had always been that way, and I had misremembered. I tried marking the rock, scratching lines with a knife, stacking small cairns, but every time I circled back, the marks were gone or rearranged into patterns I hadn't made. The air thickened with a low hum, vibrating faintly in my chest, as if the canyon were considering its next move. Deeper in the labyrinth, the shadows began to move with unnerving grace. They slid across stone without any connection to the sun. Smooth, fluid, gliding as though cast by something hidden just beyond the edges of my vision. These silhouettes stretched unnaturally tall, tapering into points, drifting without sound. When I tried to shine my flashlight directly on one, the beam seemed to pass through it, scattering like mist. Yet the moment I looked away, the shadow reformed, closer than before. I kept walking, refusing to run only because some part of me understood that panic would feed whatever intelligence guided this place. Still, every turn led me deeper, the walls narrowing until the canyon felt like a throat closing around me. The air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, lingering too long, as if reluctant to fade. The layered cries I had heard for 2 nights returned, faint but present, woven into the stone itself. They rose and fell like distant breathing, accompanied by subtle shifts underfoot, the ground flexing with each spectral wail. The realization settled slowly, dreadfully. The canyon was shaping itself around my movements, adjusting its walls and corridors with each decision I made, closing off escape routes, narrowing possibilities. It wasn't trapping me out of malice. It was guiding me, deliberately, patiently, deeper into its body. And with each step I felt the unmistakable certainty that it already knew exactly where it intended to lead me. The deeper I moved, the more the canyon felt alive. Not metaphorically, not as some poetic exaggeration, but with a physical certainty that tightened around my ribs. The screams began again, just as the light thinned into a dull, copper haze. They didn't drift from one direction this time. They erupted everywhere at once. From the stone beneath my boots, from the cliffs above me, from the narrow slits between rocks where no body could possibly fit. Each cry folded into the next, creating a dissonant harmony that felt too coordinated to be random, a kind of chorus practiced over centuries. The rock vibrated with every layered voice, a pulsing rhythm that crawled through my bones and settled deep in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat until I couldn't distinguish one from the other. I tried pressing my palms against the canyon wall, hoping to ground myself, but the stone felt disturbingly warm, as if something massive shifted just beyond the surface, breathing slow and heavy. Shadows darted at the edges of my vision, quicker now, no longer shy about their presence. They flickered like limbs caught mid-motion, bending at impossible angles, stretching too far before snapping back into darkness. Each time I turned, I caught the faintest outline of something tall withdrawing behind a rock or slipping into a crack. None of them ever let me see their full form. None needed to. Their presence alone, persistent and coordinated, told me I was surrounded. A low hum began beneath the screams, so deep I felt it more than heard it. It tremored through the canyon floor in deliberate pulses, like a message tapped out in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I felt cold despite the heat emanating from the stone. My thoughts grew blurry, muddled by the rhythmic pounding beneath my feet. That was when the understanding crept in. A slow, dreadful clarity. The canyon wanted something from me. Not my escape, not my fear. It wanted acknowledgement. The screams intensified, swirling in tight circles that made the air itself vibrate. They pitched higher, warping into elongated wails that scraped the inside of my skull. I staggered forward, gripping the wall for balance, and a voice, clearer than the rest, rose from directly beneath my hand. A singular, desperate cry, so sharp and human that it tore breath from my lungs. I jerked back, heart slamming, but the voice followed, rising through the stone as though it knew I had heard it at last. The canyon's chorus responded in a sudden unified swell, a triumphant, sickening crescendo that rolled through the labyrinth like a living exhale. The ground pulsed once, heavy and expectant. The shadows drew closer, holding just beyond sight, and in that trembling moment with the rock humming beneath my feet and the cries pressing against my skull, I felt the canyon waiting, anticipating my answer, urging me to finally respond to its haunting, hungry call. Morning should have come with relief, but instead it felt like time had stalled, caught in the canyon's throat. Light seeped into the labyrinth in thin, uncertain strands, as though hesitant to touch the stone. I pushed toward what I thought was the direction of the exit, but every ledge I climbed led only to new walls, sheer and unfamiliar. Places I knew hadn't existed the night before now rose above me like ancient monuments, blocking out the weak dawn. I tried scaling a promising ridge. Solid handholds, clear footing, but halfway up, the rock tilted subtly under my palms, shifting its angle so that the ledge I aimed for stretched farther away, receding like a mirage. When I climbed back down, breath shaking, the base of the cliff was different. Smoother, taller, its cracks sealed as if the stone had healed itself. The screaming that had filled the night had finally quieted, but its absence felt worse. The silence pressed into my ears like pressure from deep water, and beneath it I could still feel the canyon's pulse, soft, persistent, echoing in my chest. My heartbeat matched it whether I wanted it to or not. With each step, the ground vibrated lightly, as if reminding me the canyon wasn't done with me. I tried shouting for help, but the sound didn't travel. It folded in on itself, muffled by the towering walls until it sounded like I was yelling into cupped hands. Shadows continued to move where light should have held them still. They slid along the stone with eerie fluidity, longer now, stretched thin like strands of ink bleeding through paper. When they paused with me, holding perfectly still until I moved again. The air tasted metallic, sharp on the tongue. A faint trembling began underfoot, not violent enough to topple rocks, but rhythmic, steady, patient, like the canyon remembering something or someone. I climbed another ledge, desperate for an angle that showed sky unfractured by stone. Instead, I found a new overhang curving inward, forming a bowl-shaped hollow that hadn't existed minutes earlier. I scrambled back down, panic gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The realization came slowly, dreadfully. The canyon wasn't trapping me. It was reshaping itself around me, reacting to me the way a body reacts to an irritant. Not a prisoner, not prey, something it needed to keep. I pressed my palm to the stone again, and the vibration rose to meet it, warm and rhythmic, almost welcoming. That warmth deepened, spreading through the rock like a memory rising to the surface. My skin prickled. An image flickered in my mind, unbidden, intrusive, of others stepping here before me, swallowed by ledges that had shifted into place just as they reached for escape. The canyon remembered them. It remembered everything. And as the trembling deepened under my hand, slow and possessive, I understood with suffocating clarity. It remembered me now too, and it wasn't going to forget. The wind hit first, sharp against his face, tugging at his jacket and carrying the bitter scent of wet stone. The trail was narrow, a simple ledge carved along the canyon's edge, familiar from the maps he'd studied and the photos he'd admired. The sun had not yet fallen below the rim, and the rocks glowed faintly, warm in their own stubborn way. He stepped carefully, boots crunching over gravel, and thought he felt the day's ordinary calm settling around him. Then came the footsteps. At first, soft, irregular, almost a trick of the canyon's echo. He paused. The sound stopped. A glance over his shoulder showed only empty air, the path behind him nothing more than sun-streaked stone. His pulse picked up, a tiny tremor threading through his chest, but he shrugged it off. Perhaps another hiker, gone around the bend. The rhythm returned. Subtle and deliberate. It did not belong to the wind. Each step, each faint scuff seemed to follow him, fading when he tried to find its source. The canyon, so familiar, felt different. The air itself seemed to pulse, a soft cadence he could not name, like something breathing quietly in the crevices of the rock. A shadow stretched across the ledge ahead. Just for a moment, a flicker, elongated and impossible in shape, before it was gone. He looked again. Nothing. The trail was empty, yet the unease settled in his chest, a slow, crawling pressure. The canyon's walls, which should have been silent and still, now hinted at movement, subtle shifts that did not match the wind. Every instinct told him to turn, to run back to safety, but something deeper, quieter, held him in place. The trail felt alive beneath his boots, responsive, aware. Footsteps, shadow, and wind combined into a rhythm he could feel more than hear. It was patient, waiting for him to continue, waiting for him to follow the canyon's careful guidance. He took another step. The wind pressed against him harder. A shiver ran down his spine, colder than the air should have allowed. And then he realized he no longer walked the trail alone, or, perhaps, he had never truly walked it at all. The canyon breathed around him. The trail narrowed, curling around jagged rocks that jutted like broken teeth. Each step he took pressed him closer to the edge, where a single misstep could mean a long fall into the shadowed depths below. The wind had changed, carrying not only cold, but a strange, restless energy that tugged at the back of his mind. Behind him, the steps returned, distinct now, echoing with a deliberate precision. They matched his pace, sometimes falling slightly ahead, as if anticipating his movements. He stopped, listening. The canyon swallowed his breath. No other hiker appeared. Nothing but the rocks and the shifting shadows of wind-swept branches. Yet the sound persisted, steady, intimate, too human to ignore. Each gust carried whispers, rustling leaves and pebbles in patterns that mimicked conversation, like the canyon itself was speaking in a language he had almost forgotten. He shivered, realizing that it was not the wind at all. Something else walked beside him, unseen but undeniably present. Fear settled in his chest, slow and heavy, pressing down on his lungs. His steps became tentative, cautious, yet the echo behind him mirrored every movement, shaping a rhythm he could not escape. He glanced over his shoulder again. Shadows stretched across the canyon walls, pooling in the cracks, shifting as if alive. Sometimes they seemed to flicker in vaguely human form, rising and falling just beyond the edge of vision, dissolving when he blinked. The trail itself seemed to bend subtly beneath his feet, edges jutting unexpectedly, rocks that should have been stable sliding with the lightest pressure. Every instinct screamed that he was being guided, nudged along a path he had never chosen, led by a force patient, invisible, and watchful. The steps quickened just slightly, leaving him breathless and unsteady. The whispers in the wind carried a metallic undertone now, faint as a distant scrape, a friction against stone he could not place. He tried to call out, to name the presence that dogged him, but no sound came. His throat tightened. Every inhalation rasped, mingling with the wind, as though the canyon absorbed his voice before it could escape. Panic rippled through him, thrumming in the soles of his feet, and yet he could not stop moving. The rhythm of the footsteps, of the wind, of the shifting canyon floor, held him in its invisible grip. The path twisted, narrowing further, cliffs dropping sharply beside him, but still he moved forward. Shapes of darkness paused along the trail, lingering in corners of his vision, disappearing whenever he looked directly. His heartbeat thudded in sync with the steps behind him, a mockery of his own cadence, a whisper of control he did not possess. Every shadow, every rustle, every echo felt intentional, as though the canyon itself had drawn lines in the air and he was following them unwillingly. He realized then that he was no longer walking the trail. The trail was walking him. Each step, each measured breath, each flicker of shadow was orchestrated beyond his understanding. And somewhere in the canyon's hollowed ribs, something waited, unseen, shaping the rhythm, waiting for him to reach the place he could not yet imagine, until the wind carried only the sound of his own footsteps, and nothing else. The path beneath his boots had never felt so unstable. Rocks that had seemed solid a moment ago crumbled without warning, sliding into the canyon's depths like tiny avalanches, as if the trail itself were mocking him. He stumbled once, catching the edge of a jutting stone, heart hammering, fingers slick with sweat. The wind had picked up again, cold and urgent, pressing against his face and ripping at his clothes. It carried the faint metallic tang of something long buried in stone, a scent that made the back of his throat tighten. Shadows grew longer along the canyon walls, stretching in impossible directions, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Sometimes he thought he saw a figure leaning just over a ledge, pausing to watch him, only to vanish when he blinked. His chest tightened. The rhythm of footsteps behind him, once steady and measured, had merged with the noise of shifting stone. The canyon seemed to anticipate his movements, tilting subtly, forcing him to adjust, to follow a path he had not chosen. He placed each step carefully, but the rocks betrayed him. Patterns formed beneath his boots, small stones falling in sequences too precise to be random. The trail itself seemed aware, reacting to his weight, to the sound of his breathing. He tried to focus on the canyon's edge, to trust the familiar lines he'd followed before, but the ground shifted like water, and the shadows clung to him, dancing along the walls with silent patience. A sudden gust forced him against the cliff's edge. He clutched the stone wall with trembling hands, the scrape of rock against his palms echoing through the narrow canyon. Somewhere in the wind, he thought he heard faint laughter or crying, indistinguishable, fleeting. The canyon was orchestrating his movement, bending him to its will. Every instinct screamed to stop, to turn back, but the ledge behind him was littered with fallen stones and the echoes of footsteps that were not his own. He realized, with a rising, suffocating dread, that he was no longer merely walking the trail. The trail was shaping him, guiding him along each precarious ledge, forcing him to navigate patterns he could not see but felt in the soles of his feet, in the tensing of his muscles, in the rhythm of his breath. Every step, every shiver of wind, every shifting shadow whispered that the canyon knew where he had to go and that he had no choice but to obey. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, leaving a twilight cold and gray. The stones beneath his feet seemed to shiver with anticipation, and the shadows along the walls grew more deliberate, forming angles and shapes that pressed against his peripheral vision. He felt them there, shaping the path, waiting, unseen, patient. He moved forward, balancing along the edge, heart drumming in perfect alignment with the canyon's pulse, knowing he was no longer the master of his steps. Somewhere deeper in the stone and wind, the canyon was waiting. The canyon grew quieter in a way that pressed against his ears. The wind, once sharp and biting, softened into a sibilant whisper, carrying the faint rustle of movement he could not place. He tried to convince himself it was merely the rocks settling, the canyon breathing, but the shadows along the cliff walls told another story. They lingered, clustering in dark pockets, moving subtly against the wind's pull, rising and falling in rhythm with something unseen. Some of them were almost human. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw shoulders, the curve of a head, an arm that lingered too long at the edge of his vision. He blinked. They vanished. Yet the sense of being watched did not fade. Each stretch of trail pressed him forward, toward a point he could not see, a place he had not chosen. The ledges tilted just enough to make balance precarious, rocks crumbling as though the path itself resisted him, guiding him like a hand from the darkness. The footsteps behind him had merged with the canyon's own noises, the scrape of loose stone, the sighing wind, the distant echo of falling gravel. He could no longer separate his own steps from the pattern that surrounded him. He stumbled once, caught by a jutting rock, heart hammering. The shadows flinched with him, reacting, shrinking away, only to reappear a step or two further down the trail. The canyon had become a living choreography, and he was its only performer. Cold seeped into his bones as he moved. The shadows deepened, pooling where the walls turned sharply, merging into angles that shouldn't exist. The air smelled faintly metallic, like iron dust, or the memory of blood long forgotten. Each inhalation carried the cadence of footsteps, though none were visible. He felt their presence behind, beside, perhaps even ahead, guiding him. The canyon was patient, waiting for him to reach the point where the trail might end, or where it might claim him entirely. He wanted to run, to throw himself over the edge and escape the invisible rhythm, but fear rooted him. The shadows whispered in movements rather than words, pressing him forward, shaping the pace of his breathing, the timing of his steps. It was a silent insistence, irresistible and unrelenting. He realized then that the canyon was not simply a place. It was a force, deliberate, patient, orchestrating terror in every fold of stone and shadow. As twilight bled into darkness, he sensed the figures along the walls multiplying, stretching and twisting against the cliff. They moved with intention, yet remained untouchable, impossible to name. Every instinct screamed that he was no longer in control, that he had been guided from the first step, the trail itself shaping him into someone, or something, it could use. And still, he walked, the canyon alive around him, shadows shifting, waiting and following, patient as the cold air that seeped into his bones. The sound came first. Not the wind, not the scrape of stone, but the footsteps. Sharper now, quicker, almost impatient. They no longer matched his pace. They anticipated it, landing just before he did, falling into the canyon's invisible rhythm. He froze for a moment, heart hammering, the ledge beneath his boots threatening to betray him. The shadows along the walls deepened, pooling into shapes that twisted in ways that made no sense, angles that should have been impossible. He wanted to turn, to break the pattern, to run, but his body betrayed him. Each step forward felt dictated, measured by the canyon itself, by the unseen presence that had been walking with him all along. The trail narrowed dangerously, cliffs dropping sharply on one side, jagged rock scraping against the other. Every gust of wind carried echoes like metal grinding against stone, tiny scratches that seemed to follow him, mirroring his panic. He glanced behind, searching for the source of the steps, but found nothing. Only the canyon, stretching out and closing in at the same time. The rhythm of the unseen footsteps quickened as he did, and a cold, hollow sensation settled in his chest. He realized, with a rising, suffocating dread, that he was being herded. Not guided, not followed, but herded. The trail was no longer his own. His freedom had been stripped with each careful, measured step he had taken along the cliffs. The wind flung itself against his face, tearing at his jacket, forcing him to lean into it, and the metallic echoes grew sharper, like claws scraping rock just out of sight. The canyon seemed to narrow, to tilt subtly, making balance a struggle, but the pressure behind him was relentless, pushing him forward faster than his legs wanted to carry him. Fear became a drumbeat in his ears, mixing with the cadence of the steps that were no longer echoes but commands. Shapes appeared along the cliff walls, twisted, elongated, moving against the wind's pull. Some lingered too long at the corners of his vision, vanishing when he looked directly, leaving him with the unnerving sense that they had been studying him all along. The trail's edge felt alive, shifting imperceptibly beneath his boots, guiding him into a path he could not see, toward a place he did not know. Every instinct screamed to stop, to run, to fight back against the pull, but it was useless. The canyon had claimed his motion, his heartbeat, the very timing of his breath. He was no longer walking, he was being moved, a passenger in a force that had orchestrated the rhythm from the very first step. The shadows, the wind, the scraping echoes, they were all part of it, part of a design too vast, too patient to resist. And still, he moved. Faster now. The trail narrowed. The footsteps quickened. The canyon pressed, shaping, guiding, herding, and he could feel, deep in his chest, the terrifying certainty. He would go where it wanted, whether he wished to or not. The canyon had changed. He could feel it in every muscle, in every cautious step along the narrow ledges. Rocks that had seemed steady now slanted under his weight, tilting ever so slightly, forcing him to adjust or fall. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, elongating and twisting as if the sun itself had bent to the canyon's will. The wind no longer blew freely. It moved with intention. A vertical current that pressed against him, lifting him, pushing him, shaping the motion of his body. Footsteps echoed behind him, but they were no longer random, no longer a mimicry of his own. They collided with the wind, with the shifting stones, forming a pattern that he could feel in the soles of his boots, in the tightening of his chest, in the rhythm of his breath. He tried to break the cadence, to step differently, but the canyon resisted. Each deviation was corrected, subtly, inexorably. His body obeyed a will he could not name, a choreography of stone, shadow, and wind. He sensed something moving just beyond sight, a presence in sync with the cliff itself. Sometimes he caught glimpses, a flicker along the wall, a shadow that stretched too far, a movement that paused and tilted as if observing him. It was patient, deliberate, almost affectionate in its control, and yet the realization struck him with cold terror. He was no longer walking the trail. The trail was walking him. The wind carried strange echoes, scraping along the rocks like distant nails on metal. Each gust felt like a hand, guiding him forward, angling the ledges beneath his feet. He stumbled once, heart hammering, gripping the cliffside, and the stones beneath him seemed to sigh, shifting just enough to steady him, to coax him along the path the canyon demanded. Panic rose, sharp and metallic, but he could not stop. To resist was to risk falling, to be consumed by the canyon's patient, invisible orchestration. Shadows clustered at corners, lingering in shapes that were almost human, almost alive, pausing as he approached and vanishing when he dared to look directly. Their presence was more than suggestion, it was instruction. Every motion of the air, every tilt of the ledge, Every shifting stone carried a message he could not decipher, but could not ignore. The canyon was teaching him, guiding him, pressing him toward some destination, some resolution that he could not yet perceive. Night crept along the canyon walls, shadows deepening into shapes that no light could penetrate. The wind whistled low, a continuous hum that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat. He realized, with a suffocating clarity, that he was no longer moving by choice. He was part of a larger rhythm, an invisible design etched into stone, wind, and shadow. Each step forward was both his own and not his own, a motion compelled by the canyon itself. And so, he walked, not as a man, but as a passenger in something alive, patient, deliberate. The canyon guided, the wind pressed, and shadows followed. He could feel it in every fiber of his body. He was no longer free. The trail ended without warning. One step forward, and there was nothing but vertical darkness, the canyon dropping away into a yawning void that swallowed sound and light. Yet the echoes continued. Footsteps, soft and precise, carried past the edge, mingling with the rhythm of his own pulse. He froze, staring into the emptiness, trying to locate their source. There was none. Only the canyon, patient and unyielding, breathing around him. Shadows along the cliffs stretched and merged in the failing light, forming figures that paused as he approached. He took a careful step forward, heart hammering, and the shapes dissolved, folding into the stone as if they had never existed. But their absence was not comfort. The trail had vanished, yet the presence remained. Persistent, deliberate, a force older than stone and wind. Every gust seemed tuned to him, carrying the cadence of steps he could not distinguish from his own heartbeat. The wind tugged at him from all sides, low and insistent, carrying a metallic tang and the faint, impossible echo of laughter or weeping. He turned slowly, half expecting to see another human being, or some monstrous imitation, but found only the canyon itself. Quiet now, except for the whispered rhythm that had followed him from the beginning. The walls, the ledges, the shadows, they were still alive, patient, deliberate, guiding him to a place that could not exist on any map. He wanted to step back, to retrace the path he had taken, but the stones behind him had shifted, settled into forms that resisted his weight. The canyon had rearranged itself while he walked, molding the trail, orchestrating each movement, and now there was no trail to return to. Panic rose, cold and thick, mingling with awe. He realized with a clarity that chilled him to the bone. He had never walked freely. Every step, every stumble, every heartbeat had been dictated by something vast, deliberate, and unseen. The figures in the shadows reappeared, flickering along the cliff walls, half human, half impossibility, dissolving whenever he looked directly. And the echoes of footsteps, some his own, some not, resonated around him in perfect synchronization. The canyon's rhythm had become his rhythm. There was no difference, no separation, only the pull of the walls, the tilt of the ledges, the breath of the wind shaping him. He took one last step to the very edge. The abyss yawned beneath him, silent and infinite, and the shadows paused, as if watching. His own heartbeat thundered, matching the cadence that had guided him all this way. The canyon waited, patient, deliberate, and then it fell silent. He stood there, suspended between stone and air, and wondered whether he had ever truly walked of his own volition, or if, from the first step, the canyon had been walking him.